The only real difference between him and Basil is that he was small and had a very large henpecking wife.
So I didn't have any problems with saying what I didn't think was funny. No, I don't believe that. Why does he say that?
There are television moments that make you laugh, moments that make you think. And then there are moments so combustible, so unexpectedly raw, that they ignite a debate lasting decades. Fawlty Towers, the short-lived, brilliantly chaotic British sitcom that somehow packed more genius into 12 episodes than most shows manage in 12 seasons, produced exactly that kind of moment. A scene so provocative, so deliriously over the top, that it quietly followed the show off the air and has never truly stopped causing trouble since. To understand why that scene hit so hard, though, you have to understand where the whole magnificent disaster began. It was 1970, and the Monty Python team had rolled into Torquay, a sleepy seaside resort on England's southwestern coast, to film segments for their television series. They needed somewhere to sleep. What they found instead was something far more valuable, a living, breathing masterclass in how not to treat another human being. The Gleneagles Hotel was managed by a man named Donald Sinclair, and Sinclair operated his establishment with a kind of cheerful contempt for guests that would be remarkable in any industry, let alone hospitality. John Cleese, already razor-sharp in his observation of human absurdity, watched Sinclair with a focused attention, a naturalist discovering a new species. Here was a man who had somehow convinced himself that running a hotel was a burden imposed upon him by ungrateful visitors. When Eric Idle left his briefcase briefly in the lobby, Sinclair didn't ask whose it was or suggest it be moved. He hurled it over a garden wall, apparently convinced it contained a bomb. When Terry Gilliam held his cutlery in a manner Sinclair found objectionable, the manager descended on him like an etiquette inspector from a particularly unhinged government agency. Most of the Python team fled within days. Cleese stayed on, mesmerized. What Cleese recognized in Sinclair wasn't just rudeness. It was something richer and stranger, a man of towering self-importance, paralyzed by his own anxiety and snobbery, who turned every guest interaction into a fresh catastrophe of his own making. Sinclair was a joke, not the guests. That distinction would become the philosophical backbone of everything that followed. Years later, working alongside his then-wife and creative partner Connie Booth, Cleese began constructing a character from those Torquay memories. Basil Fawlty was not simply a rude hotel manager. He was something more tragicomic, a man desperately striving toward a genteel respectability he could never quite reach, undermined at every turn by his own explosive temper, his spectacular inability to manage stress, and his genius for offending precisely the people he most wanted to impress. Booth and Cleese understood that the comedy would only work if the audience always saw Basil as the architect of his own destruction. He was never the smart one. He was always the punchline. Fawlty Towers premiered on the BBC in September 1975, and the early critical reception was, to put it generously, confused. Some reviewers genuinely didn't know what to make of it. The pacing was relentless. The humor was dense, and the central character was a man audiences were simultaneously laughing at and wincing for. But viewers understood immediately what critics had missed. They recognized Basil. They'd met him at the post office, at the local council office, at some miserable bed and breakfast on a rainy English holiday. He was real, and his suffering was delicious. The show ran for only 2 series. 6 episodes in 1975, and another 6 in 1979, and both Cleese and Booth have been consistent over the years in explaining why they stopped. They felt they had said everything they wanted to say about these characters, and they preferred to leave something perfect rather than dilute it chasing further success. In an era of television defined by endless sequels and reboots, that restraint looks almost radical. Among those 12 episodes, one stands apart. Not merely as the most memorable, but as the most contested piece of television comedy Britain has ever produced. The Germans, which aired as the 6th and final episode of the first series in October 1975, begins with Basil recovering from a concussion sustained during the hanging of a moose head, a detail that tells you everything you need to know about where this is heading. A group of German tourists arrive at Fawlty Towers as guests, and Basil, even to the fog of his head injury, is determined to do one thing above all else: not mention the war. He issues this instruction to his staff with the gravity of a military commander briefing troops before a sensitive operation. And then, with the inevitability of a man walking toward a cliff he has spotted from a mile away, he proceeds to mention the war, repeatedly, enthusiastically, with escalating theatrical commitment. What begins as awkward verbal stumbles accelerates into something that left 1975 audiences genuinely unsure whether they were watching genius or catastrophe. Basil, by now unmoored from any remaining social restraint, launches into an extended impersonation of Adolf Hitler, goose-stepping to the hotel lobby, one finger pressed beneath his nose as a makeshift mustache, while his bewildered German guests look on in mounting horror. It is one of the most uncomfortable minutes in the history of British television, and it is also, depending entirely on your perspective, one of the funniest. The response was immediate and fierce. Letters arrived at the BBC in significant numbers. Critics who had been uncertain about the show suddenly had something very certain to say about it, most of it negative. There were calls for the episode to be pulled from any future broadcasts, and more broadly, questions about whether the show had revealed something ugly beneath its clever surface. BBC executives held serious internal discussions about whether the Germans should simply disappear from the archive, a quiet institutional burial that would spare everyone further embarrassment. The complaint wasn't frivolous, and it deserves to be taken seriously even decades later. The Second World War was not ancient history in 1975. Millions of people watching that broadcast had lived through the conflict. They had lost family members, had served in uniform, had grown up in bombed cities. For them, watching a fictional British hotelier perform a comedy Hitler in prime time was not an exercise in ironic distance. It was a raw provocation, and the fact that it was labeled satire did not automatically neutralize the sting. The BBC did not ultimately pull the episode outright, but the controversy surrounding it contributed to a broader atmosphere of nervousness around the show. Fawlty Towers had always operated close to the edge of what broadcasters were comfortable airing. The Germans pushed it closer to that edge than anything that had come before. John Cleese has never accepted the premise that the episode was offensive in the way its critics claimed. His defense, articulated in interviews over many years, is precise and worth examining carefully. The target of every joke in The Germans, he has argued, is Basil himself, his anxiety, his obsessive relationship with British wartime mythology, his inability to function under social pressure. The German guests are portrayed throughout as dignified, patient, and ultimately baffled. They are not the butt of anything. Basil is. This is a legitimate reading of the episode, and it is the reading most supported by what's actually on screen. The German tourists do not do or say anything ridiculous. Basil does. The comedy of the goose-step scene derives entirely from watching a middle-aged English hotel manager humiliate himself catastrophically in front of paying guests he is desperate to impress. The war references don't mock the war or its victims. They mock Basil's strange, neurotic fixation on it, which the episode frames as a peculiarly British cultural affliction rather than a universal one. Cleese has also pointed out, with characteristic directness, that satire which only targets people everyone already agrees is acceptable to target isn't really satire at all. It's applause. Real satire makes people uncomfortable, and the Germans made people uncomfortable in ways that revealed something true about British culture, a culture that had, by the mid-1970s, developed a complicated, sometimes obsessive relationship with its wartime identity. Decades passed, and the Germans moved from controversy into something approaching canonical status. It consistently topped polls of the greatest individual sitcom episodes ever broadcast in Britain. Lines from it entered the permanent vocabulary of British cultural life. Don't Mention the War became shorthand for an entire national psychology, deployed in contexts far beyond television comedy. The episode had done what the best satire does. It had become more true over time, not less. And then streaming arrived, and with it a new wave of re-examination. Digital platforms hosting classic television suddenly found themselves making editorial decisions about material that had been produced under entirely different cultural assumptions. Several services removed the Germans entirely from their Fawlty Towers offerings. Others aired edited versions, with specific lines or moments cut or muted. The goose-step sequence proved particularly contentious. Some platforms kept it, others didn't. The reaction from fans was intense. For many viewers, the edits felt like a fundamental misunderstanding of what the episode was doing. A misreading so profound it transformed an anti-racist satire into a sanitized product that had lost its entire argumentative point. If you edit out the moment Basil humiliates himself most completely, you have not protected anyone from offense. You have simply removed the punchline that makes the joke moral rather than merely cruel. Cleese entered this debate publicly and without apparent concern for diplomatic niceties. The removals and edits, in his view, represented exactly the kind of well-intentioned cultural censorship that ultimately damages the capacity of art to do useful work in the world. Comedy that cannot make people squirm, he has argued, cannot make people think. What the controversy around the Germans ultimately revealed was something more interesting than a simple argument about taste or decency. It revealed how much weight a single scene can carry when it is embedded in a work of genuine cultural significance. The episode mattered enough to argue about because Fawlty Towers mattered, because in 12 episodes, Cleese and Booth had created something that had burrowed so deeply into British cultural consciousness that removing any part it felt like an act of revision, not protection. The show's remarkable achievement was to make a character who is, by any reasonable measure, a terrible person, snobbish, volatile, contemptuous of almost everyone around him, into someone audiences found not just funny but oddly sympathetic. Basil was trapped, and somehow that made his disasters bearable to watch. He wanted so much and achieved so little, and every episode turned the screws a little tighter on his impossible aspirations. The Germans was simply the episode where those screws turned hardest. Whether the scene that effectively followed the show off the air was bold satire or reckless provocation remains a genuinely open question, and perhaps that is precisely as it should be. Great comedy has never been obligated to resolve the arguments it starts. It is only obligated to start them honestly. And on that count, Fawlty Towers, in its most controversial hour, delivered something that decades of television have failed to match. The hotel may have closed. The controversy has never checked out.